At 4:40 in the morning on January 18, 1943, somewhere along the frozen outer ring near Stalingrad, a Soviet mechanic lay flat beneath the belly of a T-34 that German observers had already counted as dead. Verify. His name in the surviving reports may never have been written down. That was common. Tank commanders had names. Brigade commanders had names. Men who crawled under wrecked machines in the dark often became part of the background machinery of war. But in that hour, with snow pressed against his chest and oil running slowly across his sleeve, he was the difference between a wreck and a weapon. The tank above him had no right to move. One track had been torn loose by anti-tank fire. The left side armor was scarred where a shell had struck at an angle and failed to fully penetrate. A road wheel had cracked. The rear deck was blackened by smoke. Inside, the air still carried the smell that every tank crew knew and feared. Hot metal, burned insulation, diesel, sweat, and something harder to name. To the German gun crew watching that field the day before, the matter had been settled. The Soviet tank had stopped. It had sat still under fire. The crew had either escaped, died, or been pulled away. In the neat arithmetic of battle reports, it was a kill. But the Eastern Front rarely respected neat arithmetic. In the darkness, 2 Soviet repairmen had reached the tank with a coil of cable, several track links, a hammer, a crowbar, and parts stripped from another ruined vehicle nearby. They spoke little. Their hands were too cold for wasted movement. Every strike of metal against metal sounded too loud. Somewhere ahead, a German machine gun fired short bursts into the darkness, not aiming at anything clear, only reminding the night that it was being watched. A flare rose. For several seconds, everything became white. The mechanic beneath the tank stopped breathing. The broken track hung near his shoulder. Snowflakes drifted into the open engine deck. The flare hissed above the field, falling slowly, turning every wreck into a black shape against the frozen ground. No one moved. Then the light faded. He reached again for the wrench. This was the part of war that rarely appeared in dramatic paintings or victory speeches. No flag, no charge, no commander pointing toward destiny. Only a man with numb fingers, trying to join dead metal to living metal before dawn made the work impossible. The German army had come east with many assumptions. Some were tactical, some were racial, some were industrial, some were simply practical. One of them was this: a tank that had been knocked out was no longer part of the battle. It was a reasonable belief in many circumstances. A tank without a track could not maneuver. A tank with a damaged engine could not advance. A tank abandoned in open ground was waiting to be finished off. German crews had been trained to identify targets, disable them, and move on. If flames appeared, if the turret stopped, if the crew bailed out, the tank was recorded as destroyed. Yet, on the Soviet side, especially after the first disastrous months of the war, another belief took hold. Destroyed was not always destroyed. Sometimes destroyed meant waiting for darkness. Sometimes it meant missing a track. Sometimes it meant the engine would turn if someone could clear the fuel line. Sometimes it meant the turret was jammed but the gun still fired. Sometimes it meant one tank was dead, but 3 others could be made alive from its parts. A quiet sound came from the T-34's engine compartment. Not a roar. Not yet. A cough. The mechanic froze again, this time not from fear, but from listening. Another man leaned over the engine deck, his face gray in the dark, and worked the starter again. The battery was weak. The engine resisted. For a moment, it seemed the German report would be correct after all. Then the diesel caught. The sound rolled across the field, low and uneven, like an animal waking from shock. Far ahead, a German sentry lifted his head. The tank that had been killed was breathing. And before the sun came up, that dead tank would begin to move. But to understand why that sound mattered, you have to understand what the Germans thought they were seeing when they looked at Soviet armor, and what they failed to see beneath it. A knocked-out tank was supposed to stay dead. To German tank crews, the battlefield had categories. A moving tank was a threat. An immobilized tank was a target. A burning tank was finished. An abandoned tank was a prize or scrap, or something to be destroyed when time allowed. This way of thinking was not foolish. came from experience. German armored warfare had been built around speed, observation, coordination, and decision. A commander looked through optics, judged distance, called the target, fired, watched the effect, and moved. The battlefield demanded speed. If every damaged enemy vehicle had to be inspected like a court case, the attack would stall. So men learned to trust signs. A stopped tank. A hatch thrown open. Smoke from the rear. A turret that no longer traversed. A crew running low across the snow. Those signs became language. In France, in 1940, German armored units had often moved through enemy formations faster than the defenders could recover. In North Africa, a knocked-out tank exposed in the open could remain under observation until it was burned, captured, or abandoned. The pace of battle taught a cruel lesson. Once a machine stopped moving, it was halfway to becoming scenery. The Eastern Front taught a different lesson, slowly and at great cost. Their distance distorted everything. A tank might be knocked out in the afternoon, lie between the lines through the evening, and disappear before morning. Snow might hide tracks. Smoke might hide repair work. Darkness might cover men with cables and tools. A front line could shift a few hundred meters, and suddenly a wreck thought to be unreachable was inside Soviet hands again. German reports could say destroyed, but the word had cracks in it. Some tanks were burned completely. Some exploded. Some were penetrated so violently that nothing useful remained. Those were true losses. But many others lived in a gray zone. Their crews might be dead, but their engines intact. Their tracks might be gone, but their guns still usable. Their armor might be scarred, but their hulls sound. Their radios might be useless, but in Soviet service, a radio was not always essential for a tank to be pushed back into the next fight. A German officer reading a report in a field headquarters might see 10 Soviet tanks knocked out and assume the enemy's armored strength had been reduced by 10. A Soviet mechanic looking at the same field might see something else. 1 engine, 2 usable guns, 3 sets of road wheels, 4 lengths of track, a fuel pump, a gearbox that might still work if opened carefully, armor plate that could be cut, welded, and bolted over a scar. The German army was not ignorant of repair. It had skilled mechanics, recovery sections, workshops, and a deep technical tradition. German vehicles were maintained by men of real ability. But the German system increasingly suffered from complexity, distance, fuel shortage, spare part problems, and the brutal fact that many of its tanks became difficult to retrieve when the front moved against them. The Soviet repair culture developed under different pressures. The Red Army had lost staggering numbers of tanks in 1941. Some were destroyed in combat. Many were abandoned because they broke down, ran out of fuel, or could not be recovered in the chaos of retreat. That catastrophe burned a lesson into Soviet thinking. Production alone was not enough. A tank had to be built, delivered, crewed, fueled, repaired, recovered, and sometimes resurrected. By 1942 and 1943, Soviet armored forces were learning that the life of a tank did not end at the moment it was hit. The question was more practical. Could it be reached? Could it be towed? Could the damage be isolated? Could another vehicle donate the part? Could a field workshop do in 6 hours what a factory manual assumed would take days? The Germans often believed the Soviet advantage was only quantity. Endless machines. Endless replacements. Endless columns from factories beyond the Urals. There was truth in the production story. Soviet industry produced tanks in numbers Germany could not match, especially as the war went on. But production was only the visible half of the machine. The other half worked at night. It worked in shell holes. It worked under tarpaulins. It worked in barns, ruined railway sheds, frozen tree lines, and muddy depressions behind the front. It worked with damaged tools, missing parts, and men who had slept 3 hours in 2 days. And because of that, a German kill claim did not always mean what German commanders hoped it meant. The first misunderstanding was simple. They believed a tank stopped by firepower had been removed from war. What they did not yet understand was that, on the Eastern Front, firepower might only begin the next job. The front that ate machines. Before a shell struck, before a mine exploded, before a German gunner found the range, the Eastern Front was already damaging tanks. Mud got into everything. It worked its way between track links and road wheels. It filled sprockets, hardened around suspension parts, froze overnight, and turned movement into punishment. In spring and autumn, the Rasputitsa could make roads disappear into brown rivers. A tank might move 3 miles and lose half a day. Engines labored. Transmissions screamed. Drivers learned to feel the machine beneath them through their hands, shoulders, and teeth. In winter, the world became another enemy. Oil thickened. Batteries weakened. Metal shrank. Fuel lines froze. Hands stuck to exposed steel. A mechanic who removed a glove to handle a small part might lose feeling in his fingers before the bolt came loose. In summer, dust replaced mud. It entered air filters, bearings, engine compartments, lungs. Heat made crews exhausted inside the hull. A tank did not need an enemy to suffer. It only needed distance, weather, and orders to keep going. Every army fighting in the East faced this. German tanks broke down too. German mechanics worked hard, often brilliantly, to keep machines running under impossible conditions. But Germany's armored force carried its own burden. Many German vehicles, especially as the war progressed, demanded careful maintenance, specialized parts, and recovery equipment that was not always available where the battle required it. A damaged Panther or Tiger could be a formidable weapon if repaired. Could also be a nightmare to move when immobilized. The Soviet T-34 had flaws, serious ones. Early models could suffer from poor visibility, cramped crew conditions, transmission problems, uneven manufacturing quality, and limited radios. Its crews often paid for those shortcomings in blood. It was not a magical machine. It was steel built under pressure by a country fighting for survival. But it had qualities that mattered in a broken world. Could tolerate rough handling. Its wide tracks helped in mud and snow. Its basic layout could be understood by men familiar with tractors and heavy machinery. Its components, while not always easy, could often be replaced under field conditions with enough tools, force, and stubbornness. It was designed and produced in a system where perfection was less valuable than usable mass. A German engineer might look at a Soviet repair and see crude work. A Soviet mechanic might look at the same repair and ask only one question. Will it move? That was the hidden problem beneath the great tank battles of the Eastern Front. Armored warfare was not only decided by armor thickness, gun caliber, muzzle velocity, or tactical doctrine. It was decided by whether a machine that broke at midnight could return by morning. Maps did not show this. A headquarters map showed arrows. Red arrows. Black arrows. Lines of advance. Defensive belts. River crossings. Encirclements. Tank armies moving toward operational objectives. But beneath each arrow was a trail of broken machines. A tank left behind because its clutch failed. A tank stuck in a ravine. A tank with a shattered idler wheel. A tank whose driver had forced the gearbox too hard in mud. A tank that took a hit, survived, and could not reverse out of the crater. A tank whose crew was alive, waiting in the cold, listening for the sound of a recovery vehicle that might never come. If those tanks stayed where they were, the arrow weakened. If they were recovered, the arrow lived. This was why mechanics became more than support personnel. They were part of combat power. Their work determined whether a tank brigade remained a brigade after 3 days of fighting, or became a list of names and wrecks. The Germans saw Soviet attacks return again and again, even after heavy losses. They often explained this with production numbers and manpower. Again, they were not entirely wrong. The Soviet Union could absorb losses on a scale that shocked German planners. But there was another truth hiding inside the numbers. A new tank from a factory might take days or weeks to reach the front. A damaged tank recovered from a field 2 kilometers away might be fighting again far sooner. That difference could decide whether an attack resumed before the enemy rested. It could decide whether a German anti-tank line had to stay awake another night. It could decide whether men at the front began to feel that Soviet armor did not simply arrive, came back. And the people responsible for that return were not generals. They were not famous tank aces. They were the men beneath the armor. The men beneath the armor. They worked where the camera rarely lingered. Behind the tank park. Beside the road. under a torn canvas sheet, in a village courtyard where every window had been blown out, in a railway shed with half the roof missing, in a frozen orchard lit by shielded lamps and welding sparks. Soviet mechanics were not one kind of man. Some were trained specialists. Some had worked in factories before the war. Some knew tractors better than tanks when they first arrived. Some had been drivers who learned repair because no one else was alive to do it. Some were barely older than boys, but their hands already carried burns, cuts, and black oil ground deep into the skin. They learned the language of damage. A knock from the engine that meant something had bent. A grind from the transmission that meant the driver had forced too much. A track tension that looked wrong even before anyone measured it. A smell from the rear deck that warned of fuel trouble. A turret that resisted movement not because the motor failed, but because the ring had warped. They did not call this heroism. Most men who do necessary work under pressure do not name it grandly. They called it repair. They called it getting the tank ready. They called it doing what could be done before the next order came. Their enemy was not only the Wehrmacht. It was time. A tank unit did not wait politely while repairs were completed. Orders came. New attacks were scheduled. Defensive gaps opened. Commanders demanded numbers. How many tanks operational? How many by dawn? How many by noon? How many can move if they cannot fire? How many can fire if they cannot move? That last question mattered more often than anyone wanted. A tank with a damaged drive system might still serve as a fixed gun. A tank with a weak engine might still crawl to a firing position. A tank with no radio might still follow another vehicle. A tank with rough welding over a penetration scar might terrify its new crew, but it might also carry them through one more attack. The mechanics lived in that gray space between impossible and useful. They stripped wrecks with a practical ruthlessness that war teaches quickly. One dead tank gave up track links. Another gave up a gun sight. Another, too badly burned to save, gave up armor plate. A road wheel from one machine found its way onto another. A fuel pump traveled from a corpse to a survivor. The battlefield became a parts yard. There was something almost primitive about it, but not ignorant. It was intelligent because it accepted reality. A formal repair system assumes supply. It assumes time. It assumes tools arrive where needed. The Eastern Front often offered none of those things. So mechanics adapted. They heated parts over fires. They hammered metal into compliance. They used cables where proper equipment was missing. They worked by touch when light would draw fire. In the German imagination, Soviet industry was often seen as crude, vast, and brutal. German soldiers sometimes mocked the rough finish of Soviet machines. Weld seams looked ugly. Interiors were uncomfortable. Controls could be heavy. Paint might be careless. But the joke lost force when the same crude machine, hit the day before, came back through the smoke with its gun still firing. A pretty machine that cannot be recovered is gone. An ugly machine that can be repaired is still in the war. That truth belonged to the mechanics. And yet they were exposed to dangers that did not resemble ordinary rear area work. A damaged tank might still have live ammunition inside. Fuel vapor might hang in the hull. A shell lodged in armor might not have detonated. A burned crew compartment might have to be cleared before repairs could begin. Men might have to work beside the dead, then prepare the same vehicle for another crew. No manual could make that clean. A mechanic might recognize a tank not by its serial number, but by its scars. The patch on the side. The dent near the driver's hatch. The uneven sound of its engine. A machine came back wounded, was repaired, went forward, and returned again worse than before. At some point, steel began to carry memory. But the war did not pause for memory. By dawn, a tank had to move. By evening, another had to be towed. By night, a third had to be stripped. Somewhere, an officer needed 3 more vehicles for the attack. Somewhere else, a German gun crew was waiting to make those vehicles dead again. The mechanics knew something the reports rarely said aloud. Some tanks could be saved. But saving them meant going forward, into the place where the shells had fallen. A warehouse without walls. On a battlefield after an armored clash, wrecks do not look like resources at first. They look like endings. A tank stopped at an angle, one track twisted beneath it. Another with its turret turned backward, as if looking over its shoulder. A third burned so hot that the snow around it melted into black water and froze again by morning. Empty shell cases, torn cable, a helmet lying upside down in the mud, smoke moving low because the wind has dropped. To an infantryman passing through, it is a place to avoid. To a mechanic, it is inventory. This was one of the quiet revolutions of Soviet battlefield practice, learning to see destroyed ground as a storage yard. Not in a comfortable, organized sense. Nothing about it was safe. The parts were scattered under observation, buried in mud, frozen to metal, surrounded by mines, or inside vehicles that might explode if handled carelessly. But they were there. And in a war of shortages, there was no such thing as useless metal until someone had proved it useless. A T-34 that could never move again might still carry a usable gun. A turret that could not traverse might still contain optics. A cracked hull might hold a working engine. Even armor plate had value. Cut, patched, welded, reused. Men became skilled at judging what could be taken quickly and what was too dangerous to touch. This was not romantic improvisation. It was forced intelligence. The Soviet Union built tanks in immense numbers, but no frontline unit ever felt it had enough of anything. Not enough recovery vehicles. Not enough spare parts. Not enough trained mechanics. Not enough daylight. Not enough sleep. So the wrecks became supply. German crews sometimes interpreted this as desperation. In one sense, it was, but desperation can produce disciplined habits when repeated long enough. Soviet repair crews developed methods. They learned which parts failed most often. They learned which damage looked fatal but was not. They learned when to tow, when to strip, and when to abandon. The forbidden idea was not written as a dramatic order. It was simpler than that. Take from the dead to keep the living moving. In normal peacetime maintenance, that might be wasteful, disorderly, even punishable. Parts have records. Vehicles have assigned components. Workshops follow procedures. But war had a way of burning paperwork before it burned steel. A mechanic standing beside 4 damaged tanks did not need a perfect repair plan. He needed one vehicle for tomorrow. So he built one. Maybe the engine came from a tank abandoned after mechanical failure. Maybe the road wheels came from a hull shattered by artillery. Maybe the gun sight was taken from a vehicle whose turret was otherwise ruined. Maybe the radio did not work at all. Maybe the armor patch was ugly, the weld uneven, the interior still smelled of smoke. But if the driver could start it, if the gun could fire, if the track held under strain, the machine returned to the line. This was where German disbelief began. They had seen Soviet armor die. They had watched shells strike. They had seen crews bail out. They had fired until the target stopped moving. They had reported success. Then, days later, perhaps in the same sector, another T-34 came forward with rough plates over old wounds and mismatched parts visible to men who knew what to look for. Was it the same tank? Maybe. Maybe not. The battlefield did not always allow certainty. But the feeling mattered. To German soldiers under pressure, Soviet armor began to seem less like a finite list of vehicles and more like a tide of damaged machines patched back into motion. That feeling could wear on men. A soldier can accept danger when he believes his efforts reduce it. If he knocks out 3 tanks and sees fewer tanks tomorrow, the world makes sense. But if the attacks continue, if the same silhouettes return through smoke, if yesterday's wreck becomes tomorrow's threat, then destruction begins to feel temporary. The mechanics had turned a psychological screw. Not intentionally, perhaps. They were not designing fear. They were trying to make engines run. But the effect was real. Every recovered tank robbed German firepower of finality. A kill was no longer always a kill. It was a question. And that question became most dangerous when the wrecks were still lying in the kill zone, close enough to recover, but close enough to die trying. Recovery in the kill zone. The hardest part was not always fixing the tank. Sometimes it was reaching it. A damaged vehicle in a rear repair park was a problem of tools, parts, and time. A damaged vehicle lying between 2 armies was a problem of nerves. The tank might be only a few hundred meters away, visible in the shallow fold of a field, its hull dark against snow or mud. Close enough to see, too far to touch safely. German guns might still cover it. Snipers might be waiting. Artillery observers might have the wreck registered. Mines might lie around it. The original crew might still be inside, wounded, trapped, silent. Someone had to decide whether it was worth recovering. That decision was never purely mechanical. A tank was valuable. A trained mechanic was valuable too. A recovery tractor, if lost, could condemn several other vehicles. An officer might order the attempt. A mechanic might quietly know that the attempt was madness. But if the tank's gun was intact, if the engine might start, if the brigade needed every vehicle for morning, madness acquired a certain logic. The recovery team waited for darkness. Not peace. There was no peace. Just darkness. They moved low, carrying cable and tools. Men who had spent the day tightening bolts now crawled like infantry. The field smelled of churned earth, explosive residue, and burned fuel. Snow or mud clung to their sleeves. No one spoke above a whisper. The wreck grew larger as they approached. Up close, a tank is not an icon. It is a wall of damaged steel. Scrapes, dents, broken brackets, missing track guards, frozen mud packed into the suspension. The mechanic put a hand on the hull. It was colder than the air. First, they listened. No fire inside. No ammunition cooking off. No movement. Somewhere ahead, a German flare pistol cracked. The team pressed against the ground. Light opened over them, white and pitiless. A cable had to be attached to the towing point. Simple words. Difficult act. The towing point might be bent. It might be buried. It might require a man to expose his body for several seconds too long. Gloves made the work clumsy. Bare fingers froze. The cable was heavy and stiff. Behind them, another tank or tractor waited in darkness, engine barely turning, ready to pull. The first attempt failed. The cable slipped or snapped. That happened. Under strain, steel cable could whip through the air with enough force to maim. Men learned to fear cable almost as much as shellfire. 1 second it was a lifeline, the next a blade. The mechanic went forward again. There are moments in war when courage does not look like courage because there is no time to pose for it. A man curses under his breath, crawls back into fire, fixes the cable, and hopes no one has seen him clearly enough to shoot. The second pull began. First, nothing. The tank remained stuck, frozen into its own crater. The towing engine strained. Tracks churned. Mud sucked at the hull. Then the wreck shifted just a little. A sound came from beneath it. Ice breaking, metal dragging, earth releasing what it had taken. The men pulled again. This time the tank moved. Not like a proud machine. Not like a charge. It came backward slowly, wounded and reluctant. Its broken track grinding. Its hull scraping through mud and snow. German fire began moments later, not precise at first, then closer. Shells landed behind it. Dirt struck the armor. A man fell, got up, stumbled, kept moving. The recovery team did not cheer. Cheering wastes breath and draws attention. They got the tank behind cover. Only then did the second battle begin. The engine deck opened. Lamps were shielded. Tools came out. Someone checked the fuel system. Someone examined the track damage. Someone climbed into the turret and found the gun still usable. The driver's position was a mess of bent fittings and smoke smell. The transmission might be damaged. The left side suspension needed work. It was not a quick repair, but it was not scrap. That distinction mattered. By midnight, the tank had been written into one category. By dawn, the mechanics were trying to force it into another. And if they succeeded, the Germans who had fired on it would learn something deeply unsettling. They had not destroyed a tank. They had merely delayed it. The same tank returns. The next morning, the German line expected movement. It always did. On the Eastern Front, quiet was never trusted. Men watched tree lines, low ridges, ruined farm buildings, and the pale openings between smoke. Anti-tank crews checked ammunition. Machine gunners stamped feeling into their feet. Officers lifted binoculars and saw what they had seen too many times before. Broken ground, scattered wrecks, and beyond them the possibility of another Soviet attack. Then came the sound. Tank engines. At first, distant. A low vibration more felt than heard. Then closer, spreading across the field in uneven waves. German soldiers learned to distinguish engines with the same instinct that sailors learn weather. A truck sounded one way, a half-track another. A tank carried weight in its noise. Through smoke and morning haze, the first Soviet tanks appeared. They were not parade machines. They did not move with clean symmetry. One lurched slightly as it crossed uneven ground. Another carried visible scars on its armor. A third had a patch plate welded near the side, darker than the surrounding steel. Mud-covered markings. Snow clung to the tracks. Exhaust rolled behind them. A German gunner leaned into his sight. He may not have known whether the scarred tank was the same one his unit had fired on the day before. But he knew what he felt. The sensation was not simply fear. It was violation of expectation. That vehicle should not be there. It had been stopped. It had been hit. It had been counted. And yet there it was, moving toward him with its gun alive. This was the battlefield reality that broke the clean German assumption. Soviet tanks did not need to return perfect. Perfection was a luxury. They returned patched, stiff, loud, leaking, sometimes without proper communications, sometimes with crews who did not know every fault in the machine beneath them. But they returned. A repaired tank could still suppress an anti-tank gun. Could still carry infantry close enough to assault. Could still force German infantry into cover. It could still draw fire that revealed enemy positions. It could still block a road, support a counterattack, or sit hull down as an armored gun. A wounded machine could still change the day. For German commanders, this created a cruel uncertainty in the numbers. Reports of Soviet tank losses might be accurate in the moment and misleading by morning. A tank knocked out was not always destroyed. A tank destroyed was not always unrecoverable. A battlefield left in Soviet hands became a repair opportunity. A battlefield no one controlled became a race. The Germans also recovered and repaired vehicles. They understood maintenance. But as the war moved against them, Soviet depth became more punishing. The Red Army could combine production, salvage, repair, and relentless pressure. German tactical success might destroy many tanks, but if enough damaged vehicles were pulled back and restored, the next Soviet attack could still arrive sooner than expected. And that is what war on the front. Not one tank. Not one repair. The pattern. A Soviet attack comes in. German guns fire. Tanks burn. Others stop. The field becomes littered with dark shapes. The defenders report success. Night falls. Engines move in the darkness. Cables tighten. Men crawl. Hammers strike steel beneath tarps. By morning, the number of truly lost tanks is smaller than the number claimed. Then the attack resumes. This did not make Soviet tank crews invincible. Far from it. Many died in machines repaired the night before. Many drove tanks that should have been in workshops, not assaults. Many crews knew the patch on the armor was not a guarantee, only a warning. Soviet doctrine could be harsh. Command demands could be merciless. The men inside the tanks paid the price when necessity outran safety. But the German belief still failed. They had assumed destruction was a final act. The Soviet system turned it into a process. Hit, recover, strip, patch, replace, tow, restart, return. Each step was ugly. Each step cost labor. Sometimes it failed. Sometimes the tank never moved again. Sometimes the mechanic was killed trying. But enough succeeded to matter. And in war, enough is a terrible word. Enough tanks returned to make German reports uncertain. Enough repaired vehicles appeared in later attacks to thicken Soviet strength. Enough mechanics survived the night to make wreckage useful. That was the real reversal. The Soviet Union was not merely replacing losses from behind the front. It was harvesting the battlefield itself. One tank, 1 hour, one breakthrough. The mathematics of survival in war rarely looks dramatic on paper. One tank repaired. One engine restored. One gun returned to service. One track replaced before dawn. Small numbers. Almost dull. But at the front, small numbers could bend events. A tank did not need to survive the entire war to matter. It did not need to become famous. It did not need to win a duel against a tiger or lead a breakthrough photographed for history. Sometimes it needed only to be present at a precise hour. One tank could force an anti-tank gun to fire early. One tank could draw smoke and dust across a field. One tank could carry infantry 50 meters farther than they would have gone on foot. One tank could block a village street. One tank could fire 3 shells into a machine gun nest before being hit again. One tank could make the enemy believe the attack was larger than it was. That was why repair mattered. A new tank produced in a factory was powerful but distant. It had to be completed, inspected, transported, assigned, fueled, crewed, and moved into position. A damaged tank recovered 2 kilometers from the front was already part of the battle's geography. If mechanics could return it quickly, it became immediate strength. The difference between tomorrow and next week could decide whether an opportunity survived. Commanders understood this in their own hard language. Operational readiness, combat strength, available vehicles, reparable losses, evacuation rates. These words sound cold because armies need cold words to describe hot things. But behind them lay a simple question. How much of yesterday's destruction can be turned into tomorrow's force? The Soviet answer became increasingly effective because it matched the reality of their war. The T-34 was not delicate in the way some machines were delicate. Could be rough. Could be uncomfortable. Could be badly finished by luxury standards. But it existed in a system that valued quick restoration. The men repairing it often did not need the tank to be good as new. Good enough was enough. Good enough to move. Good enough to fire. Good enough to scare the infantry opposite. Good enough to die again, if necessary, in a place where its death bought ground. That phrase should not be softened. Many repaired tanks went back into danger with crews who understood exactly what they were being asked to do. A patched vehicle might have hidden weaknesses. A hurried repair might fail under strain. A turret might jam at the wrong moment. A transmission might break while reversing. War does not reward good intentions. But not repairing them was worse. A tank left dead gave nothing. A tank stripped properly gave parts. A tank recovered and restored gave time. And time on the Eastern Front could be more valuable than steel. Think of a German defensive line after a Soviet attack. The defenders are tired. Ammunition is lower. Guns have revealed positions. Communications are damaged. Men have been awake too long. They believe they have survived the worst of it because the field ahead is full of Soviet wrecks. Now imagine that during the night, several of those wrecks vanish. By dawn, some are behind Soviet lines. By afternoon, 1 or 2 are repaired. The following morning, they join another attack. The Germans may still stop them, but the defenders have been denied rest. Their calculation has been altered. Their sense of attrition has been made uncertain. War is fought in bodies and steel, but also in expectation. If a soldier believes each successful shot reduces tomorrow's danger, he can endure. If he begins to suspect that the enemy's losses are not staying lost, fatigue deepens. This is where mechanics became strategic without standing anywhere near a strategy map. They preserved momentum. Not always. Not perfectly. Not without waste or suffering. But often enough that Soviet armored formations could absorb punishment and continue pressing. Production gave the Red Army mass. Repair gave that mass persistence. The Germans had excellent weapons. Many German anti-tank guns were deadly. German crews often fought with skill and discipline under desperate conditions. Their problem was not that they could not kill Soviet tanks. They could. Their problem was that killing a tank was not always the same as removing it from the campaign. Sometimes it came back weaker. Sometimes it came back ugly. Sometimes it came back only once. But once could be enough. And every time it returned, someone had paid for that return with cold hands, burned skin, lost sleep, and the willingness to work on a machine that might still explode beneath them. The numbers explain the logic. They do not carry the smell. For that, the story has to return to the repair yard, where oil mixed with blood, and men prepared dead machines for living crews. Oil, blood, and burned metal. A damaged tank is not empty just because it is silent. That was one of the first truths mechanics had to face. Inside the hull, there might be live shells, fuel vapor, broken glass, twisted metal, a machine gun belt spilled across the floor, a map darkened by oil, a driver's glove, sometimes bodies. No army wanted to speak too long about this part. Reports preferred categories. Vehicle recovered, vehicle repaired, vehicle written off, crew casualties, ammunition salvaged. But the men doing the work could not live inside categories. They opened hatches and found what fire had done. They climbed into fighting compartments where men had died minutes or hours earlier. They cleared space around pedals, britches, seats, radios, shell racks. They learned to move carefully, because a damaged vehicle could kill after the battle had passed. A shell that failed to explode might still be lodged in armor. Ammunition heated by fire might become unstable. Fuel-soaked cloth could ignite. A battery could spark. A careless strike of metal might turn a repair job into a funeral. And still the work continued. The emotional burden was not always visible. Men under pressure often protect themselves by narrowing attention. A bolt is a bolt. A track pin is a track pin. A cracked line must be replaced. The mind survives by staying with the task. Later, perhaps, there is time to remember whose blood was on the floor. Or perhaps there is not. A repaired tank might go to a new crew before the smell had fully left it. The men climbing in could see patches over penetrations. They could feel uneven welds. They could notice where fire had blackened the interior. A veteran might understand too much from a single mark on the armor. No one needed to say what happened to the last crew. The war had already said it. This is where the story of Soviet mechanics must remain human, not mythic. They were not magicians. They did not defeat physics. They did not make tanks immortal. They worked inside a system that could be harsh, improvised, wasteful, brilliant, and brutal at the same time. They saved machines that would be sent back into killing zones. Their success often meant someone else would soon be ordered to risk his life inside the vehicle they had repaired. That is not a clean kind of heroism. It is heavier. A mechanic might spend all night bringing an engine back to life, then watch the tank depart at dawn with a crew he barely knew. He might recognize the sound of that engine later somewhere ahead under artillery. He might see the tank return again with fresh damage. Or he might never see it return. He had given it another chance. War decided what that chance was worth. On the German side, there were men experiencing their own version of the same exhaustion. German tank recovery crews also worked in mud, snow, and fire. German mechanics also watched machines fail for want of parts. German crews also climbed into vehicles they knew might not bring them home. Respecting Soviet endurance does not require pretending German soldiers did not suffer. The Eastern Front was a grinder for everyone trapped inside it. But the Soviet repair effort had a particular character because of the scale of loss and the urgency of return. It had to normalize the abnormal. It had to make men treat catastrophic damage as a problem to be sorted. It had to turn grief into procedure. Tow it, open it, clear it, strip what cannot be saved, repair what can, send it forward. There is a kind of silence in that sequence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of men too tired to speak. Imagine a repair point at night. A tank sits beneath a torn cover. Snow falls through holes in the roof. A lamp throws weak light over the engine. A mechanic's eyes burn from smoke and lack of sleep. Someone nearby coughs. Somewhere farther off, artillery pulses like weather. A hand reaches into the engine compartment and comes back black with oil. No one says the tank is dead. That word has become too imprecise. Instead, they ask what is broken. And if the answer can be repaired before morning, then morning will receive another tank. This is the human cost behind battlefield resilience. The tank that returned was not a miracle. It was labor. It was risk. It was men working close to death so that other men could ride back toward death with armor around them. The Germans saw the result. They did not always see the hands. History often makes the same mistake. The war behind the war. After the battle, reports tried to make sense of chaos. They counted vehicles. They classified losses. They listed destroyed, damaged, repaired, missing, abandoned. They recorded ammunition, fuel, casualties, objectives taken or not taken. They turned mud, fear, fire, and noise into lines of text. Those reports mattered. Armies cannot function without them. But they also flattened reality. A tank repaired 3 times might appear as a number in readiness returns. A mechanic killed during recovery might appear as a casualty far from the dramatic center of the battle. A salvaged gun installed in another vehicle might disappear into the machinery of logistics. The war behind the war was easy to miss. Yet command increasingly understood that repair was not secondary. For armored formations, maintenance was combat endurance. A tank army could not rely only on new deliveries. It had to recover its wounded machines. It had to create repair echelons, forward workshops, evacuation systems, and salvage habits that matched the speed of operations. The Soviet system became better at this because it had to. In the early war, chaos had devoured vehicles. Retreat meant abandonment. Fuel shortage meant loss. Mechanical failure could be as final as enemy fire. But as the Red Army rebuilt itself, it learned to protect not only territory and manpower, but damaged equipment. A battlefield held after an attack became a source of recovery. A failed German counterattack might leave behind not only wrecks, but parts, guns, and lessons. German officers saw Soviet armored strength regenerate and often attributed it to production alone. That was understandable. Soviet factories beyond the Urals became symbols of industrial depth. Trains carried tanks westward in numbers that seemed to confirm every fear of endless replacement. But the front was not supplied only by distant factories. It was supplied by yesterday's wrecks. This is one reason kill claims in armored warfare are so difficult. A gun crew might honestly report a tank knocked out. They saw it stop. They saw smoke. They saw the crew leave. But unless the vehicle burned completely, exploded, or remained in enemy-controlled ground long enough to be destroyed beyond recovery, its future was uncertain. Modern readers sometimes look for clean totals. How many tanks did this gun destroy? How many did that unit lose? How many were knocked out in a given battle? The questions are valid, but the battlefield answers are often messy. A damaged tank may be counted as lost, then repaired. A repaired tank may be knocked out again. A vehicle may be abandoned, recovered, stripped, rebuilt, reassigned. A tank may exist in records as a loss while parts of it continue fighting inside another machine. This was the hidden economy of armored war, and it changed how battlefield success should be understood. Destroying Soviet tanks was necessary for the Germans, but it was not sufficient if the Soviet system could restore enough strength to continue. Tactical destruction had to become operational exhaustion. That was much harder. The Germans faced a grim problem. They could win local fights and still lose the larger contest of replacement and recovery. They could knock out tanks and still face tanks tomorrow. They could admire their own technical skill and still be overwhelmed by an enemy system that accepted imperfection and moved on. This was not because Soviet equipment was always better. Often it was not. It was because Soviet war-making increasingly understood usefulness under pressure. A repaired tank with poor finish but a working gun was useful. A patched hull with a tired engine was useful. A vehicle without radio but able to follow the lead tank was useful. A wreck that could donate parts was useful. The Germans often valued technical excellence. The Soviets, under extreme pressure, valued return to function. Both approaches had logic. The Eastern Front judged them without mercy. Recognition for the repair crews rarely came in proportion to their importance. Some received medals. Some were mentioned in unit histories. Many disappeared into the vast anonymous labor of the war. Their work was visible only in the continued movement of machines that should have been gone. And perhaps that is why the story matters now. Because when people speak of Soviet tanks, they often speak of factories, designs, commanders, or battles. They speak of the T-34 as if a tank fights by existing. It does not. A tank fights because someone fuels it, arms it, drives it, commands it, repairs it, recovers it, and repairs it again. The machine is only the visible part. The system is what keeps it alive. The tank was never just a tank. A tank looks self-contained. Armor, gun, tracks, engine, crew. It gives the illusion of being a single thing, a hard object moving through soft ground. A weapon with a number, a model, a silhouette recognizable from a distance. But no tank is only itself. Behind it stands a chain of work so long that most of it remains invisible. Miners, steel workers, factory crews, railway workers, drivers, fuel handlers, ammunition loaders, mechanics, recovery teams, welders, clerks, instructors, medics, commanders, and finally the crew inside. Break enough links in that chain, and even the best tank becomes a monument. The Soviet experience on the Eastern Front revealed this with unusual clarity. A tank's value did not end with its design. It depended on whether the army around it could keep it in use. The T-34 became famous for many reasons: sloped armor, wide tracks, a powerful gun in later variants, mass production, battlefield presence. But fame can simplify. It can make the tank seem like a lone answer. It was not. Its real strength came partly from the fact that it belonged to a war system willing to build many, lose many, recover many, and repair many. A system that treated ugly repairs as acceptable if they restored combat power. A system that allowed damaged machines to remain part of the fight. This lesson outlived the war. Modern armored doctrine understands that recovery and maintenance are not background details. Armored forces require repair vehicles, spare parts, trained crews, diagnostic skill, evacuation plans, and the ability to work under threat. A tank that cannot be recovered becomes a loss. A damaged vehicle that can be restored becomes retained strength. The Eastern Front made that lesson severe. It also exposed the danger of overvaluing elegance. A sophisticated vehicle can dominate under the right conditions. But if it is too difficult to repair, too heavy to recover, too dependent on scarce parts, or too fragile in the wrong environment, its battlefield value narrows. Simplicity is not always superiority. But repairability under pressure can become a weapon of its own. That is what the Germans struggled to fully absorb. They saw Soviet tanks as crude. They saw Soviet tactics as costly. They saw Soviet losses as immense. Much of that perception had evidence behind it. Soviet armored forces did suffer terrible losses. Soviet crews were often thrown into brutal situations. Soviet command decisions could be ruthless. But the Germans also underestimated the endurance created by a system that could absorb damage and return enough strength to the field. Not all of it. Enough. Again, that word. Enough to continue the attack. Enough to replace fear with pressure. Enough to make the enemy sleep less. Enough to turn yesterday's wreck into tomorrow's problem. The mechanic beneath the tank was part of that lesson. He did not need to understand grand strategy. He did not need to know production totals or operational plans. His world was smaller. A broken track, a damaged engine, a cable, a deadline, a cold morning, a tank commander asking whether the vehicle would be ready. But his work reached farther than he could see. If the tank moved, an infantry platoon might advance behind it. If it fired, a German gun crew might duck. If it drew fire, another Soviet unit might locate the gun. If it blocked a road, a counterattack might slow. If it survived 1 hour, that hour might matter. War often turns on such small, brutal increments. Not always on the famous decision. Not always on the dramatic charge. Sometimes on whether a mechanic can loosen a frozen bolt while shells land nearby. That is why the legacy of these men is not only technical. It is moral in a restrained sense. They remind us that wars are not fought only by those whose actions are easiest to narrate. The man who fires the gun and the man who repairs the gun belong to the same story. The crew that drives into battle and the recovery team that drags them back share the same danger, though history often lights one more brightly than the other. The Germans believed they were fighting Soviet tanks. What they were really fighting was a damaged, improvised, stubborn machine of survival. One that extended from factories to frontline mud, from command orders to frozen hands beneath a hull. And that machine did not stop working when a tank stopped moving. Dead tanks, living war. Return to the frozen field. The hour before dawn. The wreck half buried in snow. The cable stiff in a mechanic's hands. The engine refusing, then catching. The German sentry lifting his head at a sound he did not expect to hear. That sound is the whole story in miniature. A tank that should have been silent was not silent. It coughed smoke into the cold and moved. There was no miracle in it. No clean legend. No single genius turning the war by himself. Only work. Hard, dangerous, unglamorous work performed by men whose names often vanished behind the vehicles they saved. The Germans had believed in the finality of destruction. They believed that when a tank stopped, burned, or lost its track, its role in the battle had ended. In many cases, they were right. Some tanks were truly gone. Some damage could not be repaired. Some machines became graves. No amount of courage could bring them back. But the mistake was believing the category was simple. On the Eastern Front, a dead tank might be dead. Or it might be waiting for night. It might be a donor. It might be a gun without mobility. It might be a hull with a living engine. It might be 3 hours of work away from returning. It might be dragged back, stripped, welded, patched, cursed at, restarted, and sent forward again. What Germany saw as destruction, Soviet mechanics sometimes saw as delay. That difference mattered. It did not erase Soviet losses. It did not make the Red Army's suffering smaller. It did not turn the T-34 into a flawless machine or its crews into invulnerable men. The cost remained terrible. Tanks burned. Crews died. Mechanics were killed recovering machines under fire. Repaired vehicles failed. Orders arrived that no repair could make humane. But through that suffering, a hard truth emerged. Armies are not sustained by weapons alone. They are sustained by the people who keep weapons useful after reality has damaged them. The Soviet mechanics of the Eastern Front worked in the gap between theory and mud. They knew that a vehicle designed on paper became something else after shellfire. They knew that a tank was not truly understood in a factory drawing or an enemy recognition chart. It was understood at midnight, with its engine open, its track broken, its armor scarred, and another attack scheduled for morning. The Germans counted kills. The Soviet repair crews counted what could still move. And somewhere between those two ways of seeing, the war changed shape. A battlefield littered with wrecks was supposed to mean victory for the side that had made them. But if those wrecks could be harvested, if enough could be dragged back, if enough engines could be restarted, the meaning of the field changed. The dead were not always removed from the struggle. Some returned as patched steel, uneven welds, mismatched wheels, and guns that still fired. That is why this story deserves to be remembered. Not because machines came back from the dead like ghosts, but because men went out into the cold and made them useful again. They believed a dead tank was the end of the story. But what really happened was harsher, stranger, and more human. On the Eastern Front, even wreckage could be made to fight one more time. If the story reached you, share where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in war, in any uniform, on any front, in any forgotten role, you are welcome to leave their story in the comments. Warfront Archive is built for the histories that are often passed over. The mechanics, medics, drivers, radio men, engineers, and ordinary soldiers who carried the weight behind the famous battles. Subscribe to continue hearing the stories behind what they believed and what really happened.